Hey, welcome back to the class. This is a video from a PowerPoint I have made for Chapter 2, which this is week 3 or lesson 3, um, and it is about the obstacles to critical thinking. If you want to look in this concise guide book, our textbook, it's from pages 24 through 33. So here we go. Critical thinking is a systematic evaluation or formulation of beliefs or statements by rational standards. So we have to have a systematic evaluation by rational standards. And if we don't have a systematic evaluation, it fails. If we don't have a systematic formulation of our beliefs, if we don't have these things. This is just a reminder of what our definition is. If there are no rational standard, it fails. If we're, but here's the deal: we are fallible, and there seems to be no cure to that as human beings. So we must consistently apply these skills to evaluate, to have a system of that, a system of formulation, and to have rational standards in order to keep us away from sloppy thinking. There are several impediments to sloppy thinking, or impediments to critical thinking, rather, because they are sloppy and they are detrimental to logic and detrimental to the way we may behave. There are a couple categories. The first one is the hindrances have how we think. They're psychological. I just had psych there as a shortened thing, a shortened version of this. These are attitudes that will possibly be wrongly based or fears that are wrongly placed. You might have a worldview or a predisposition or a supposition that's in your mind, a cognitive idea that's not good. But the psychological has to do with our attitudes and motivations, desires, and our cognitive dispositions. But the second category, the hindrances to good critical thinking, to logic really, is what we're going to go over next week. But they can be caused by stinking thinking, false beliefs, thinking that critical thinking is even impossible. Or maybe it's an epistemological problem because you don't think we can really know, or you're not sure how much we can know. So these separations, category 1 and 2, aren't cut and dry. There are going to be some overlap. There's certainly some crossovers, but we're going to be looking at them this week and next. Before we go any further, I think this guy is on page 26. His name is W.K. Clifford. It's in the little blue box at the bottom of the page. You don't have the picture of this guy, but he suggests an arithmetician, he suggests that it is morally wrong to accept a belief without justification or evidence. So this is your discussion question of the week. You need to remember to do those simple points. Have a statement, and then a couple days later come back and reply to other people's statements. 15 points. Your statement's worth 7, and your reply for 2 of them are worth 4 points each. Do more. The more the merrier. You need to think about these things in order to get good and to understand this class and to follow the thought line here. But he's suggesting that, hey, it's always wrong everywhere for anyone to believe anything without proper evidence. But we have some self-centered thinking. That is really our psychological challenge in the how we think. We might accept a claim solely on the grounds that it advances or coincides with our interests. And this is a psychological issue. And it is an obstacle to good thinking. If they're just simply self-centered, the ego, the id, we look on page 25, but how far do we push for our own interests? You just don't care about, I mean, if we do that, we're a psychological egoist in the terms of ethics. But we're not studying that in this class. I do teach it, but how far do we go in pushing our own interests? How far is too far? Self-interest alone is is ethical egoism and psychological egoism, depending on the theory or the personal stance. But we can recognize that having a self-interest alone, just because I'm interested in this, or this is what I want to believe, that alone cannot establish truth or the truth of a claim. To base your beliefs on self-interest alone is to abandon critical thinking. Sometimes we do that. So we have to go out of the bounds of self to get to good critical thinking skills and to have good sound logic. Sometimes this is hard. So we have to overcome self-interested thinking. How do we do that? Well, there are several things we need to do. I've listed, and there are going to be 6 here. Watch out when things get very personal. You'll see that on page 27. Beware of the urge to distort your thinking just to save your face. You might want to pass the buck. It's hot potato. It's an easy way for people to control their choice. If you just do exactly, or just say exactly what they want to hear. I mean, it makes them feel better, makes you feel better. It may not be the right way to say it, but we need to be careful, not just to save face, but to stand on truth. And that's a challenge for all of us. Are you just going to say what people want to hear? Some would be puzzled or amused at your stubborn adherence if you're not willing to change at the face of truth. So there's obviously a conflict with evidence of truth in your face if you're not willing to change. What's more important, self or reality? So to overcome our self-interest, we have to beware of that urge to distort things, to save face, to watch out. That might get personal, and we need to watch out for selective attention. That is, don't just find the things that go along. We need to look for opposing evidence. We can't just find supporting evidence and find ways to make it look like supporting evidence. We need to find opposition. There are some people that like to oppose the opposers. They are just looking for opposition. I used to be that kind of person, and it's not helpful. But it does challenge thoughts, and we can be a skeptic, and we'll look at that more next week. But we need to look for opposing evidence and avoid being selective just for things that we want for our support. And then be alert to ways that critical thinking might be undermined, and ensure that nothing has been left out. So we really do need to get to know a topic before we make a really good judgment about some things. Some things doesn't take much because it's a small topic, but to be honest, philosophy, probably any class you take, you're just getting the skim of the top of those things. A doctor can't know everything out there. You want to go to a doctor that did really well in school, right? You don't want a C doctor, one who just average grades. You're not going to get one because they won't be allowed to be a doctor, pass the exams, and takes the courses if they're under a certain grade point average. So they have to be, on top of things. But anyway, getting off track there, we just need to overcome self-interested thinking by taking it all in and being aware when we are just being self-interested. Bertrand Russell said there are rational grounds for an opinion. People are content to set them forth and wait for them to operate. In such cases, people do not hold their opinions with passion. They hold them calmly. They set forth their reasons quietly. So the opinions that are held with passion are always those for which no good ground exists. Indeed, the passion is the measure of the holder's lack of rational conviction. I disagree. So I'm putting my critical thinking skills to work here. There are a lot of people very passionate about things that are very truthful. They're passionate about saving other people from something. Might want to save the dolphins, or save the whales, or save the fish in Chesapeake Bay, or something like that. I do understand, and he does clarify in the following paragraph on page 27 after using that quote. He says, if your evaluation or defense of a position evokes anger, passion, or fear, your thinking could be prejudiced or clouded. And that's more where I land. I certainly wouldn't go with Bertrand Russell's conviction that all passion is based on no good grounds. But that's where he goes. I will admit that when passions start flying, our red flag should go up, and we should be cautious. Tread lightly. We have a self-centered thinking based on our own. We also get group-centered thinking, and that's kind of where we end up telling people what they want to hear. We spend a lot of time trying to conform to groups. It's interesting that we want to be so self-supporting, we want to be autonomous, we want freedoms, yet we want to be accepted. And sometimes, people with psychological issues, they're caught in the middle of that. They want their own personal freedom, but they also want acceptance. And it's usually when they are rejected by a group is when some problems come up. We need to be careful with group-centered thinking, with group acceptance. That's not who we are. We do want to belong. We are social creatures. We want the safety and comfort of numbers. But we need to be careful that we're not sacrificing truth to do that. And this is what happens with group-centered think. It's called think tank. The trouble appears when our conformism, when we conform, hampers or totally obliterates our critical thinking skills or our logic. So we need to be careful with group-centered thinking. It is seen in several ways, and here are a few ways it is seen. It is seen through our prejudice and bias and in racism. I would like to, though, widen our definition of prejudice and bias. In the broadest sense, prejudice is a judgment or opinion based maybe on insufficient reasons. But there's a dictionary, Merriam-Webster, you can find it online, or I have one in my office. And it's injury or damage resulting from a judgment or action of another and disregarding their rights, especially. It's a detriment to one's legal rights. It could be a prejudice. Preconceived judgment or opinion is a prejudice. An adverse opinion leaning or leaning formed without just grounds before sufficient knowledge may be prejudice. An instance of such judgment or opinion, an irrational attitude of hostility directed against an individual or against a group, against a race or some characteristics. Like anti-Semitism, people hate Jews just because they're Jews. I don't even get that. But people have had it over the years. Hatred toward white men. Hatred toward, black people or Cub Scouts. Hatred toward beer or guns, Planned Parenthood, Christians, Hobby Lobby. What's the deal? I don't get these. But those are prejudices, and when we apply it to people, we generally call it racism. Lack of respect for the value or rights, or just interest of anything for these people from different geographical origins. Group-centered thinking, again, just pointing out that we are different than the Borg from Star Trek he mentioned in the text. We want to conform. So why? Peer pressure leads to appeal to the masses, appeal to popularity, a common practice, maybe. That's peer pressure. We might even succumb to prejudice or racism just based on peer pressure. We have ethnocentrism in religion or politics. Some generation, Gen X, Gen Z, Gen whatever, or anything else, ABC I just put. Because someone is in some social status, a particular part of a ladder. These are we are better than groups. That's ethnocentrism. And we need to stay away from that. These are self-centered group thinks, group tanks, thinking-wise. And they're not helpful for good critical thinking. Like people talk about the skinheads that are thinking white race is superior. I'm thinking that's about the dumbest thing I could ever hear of. I don't even get it. I've seen it in shows and stuff, but I don't know where it's coming from exactly. But groupthink is dangerous. And too often we accept them without thought or evaluation. So when we need to be careful, not and to throw out this kind of group-centered thinking and keep critical thinking. And then the last slide about group-centered thinking is stereotyping. Really classifying individuals into groups with some very oversimplified or prejudiced attitudes or opinions. So a lot of times these stereotyping is giving them a very low opinion of different people. But we do stereotype, and we need, there are some reasons we do that, because maybe 70–80% of people behave or look or have these certain characteristics. But not all of them do. So stereotypes can really be bad because they overemphasize similarities or dissimilarities. We need to recognize we're our own individual. A maturing intellect will prune these kinds of beliefs that are groundless. So there are three ways that are common ways that are very fallacious in our thinking. And here are the fallacious thinking ways. Because we are humans and we do have fallacies in our own character, none of us are perfect, we need to watch out for things. So we need to resist evidence to the contrary. The worst thing to do is to rely on evidence and reports that only come from our favored arena. We need to evaluate all viewpoints and not just limit ourselves to this kind of thinking or that kind of thinking because it came from this website or only this website. It goes for religion, it goes for race, it goes for medical, it goes for all sorts of stuff. Well, anything really. But we have a tendency to resist evidence to the contrary, and that's fallacious. We have a tendency to look for only confirming evidence. It's called a confirmation bias. And we have a tendency to prefer only the easy evidence, the available evidence, the simple stuff. But we need to stay away from that only. We need to sometimes search. So some people will say they're not willing to, say, ride a plane because they're more likely to die, when the reality of it is the odds of dying on a plane are much lower than in a car. But they prefer evidence that's easy and or whatever, and it doesn't really correlate here. But I hope this kind of gives you the impression or understanding of what we need to stay away from. The basics of psychological obstacles is how we think. And a lot of times it's based on emotion. And we need to be careful not to. Emotion is very good. Fear is good because it will tell us when maybe we should run or when we should pull back because there's a hot fire. We don't want to get burned. But we can't base everything on emotion. I see people do that and they only do what feels good. That's a very undisciplined and very unfortunate and probably short-lived life. So what we want to do is look at ways that will help us be good critical thinkers. But we need to stay away from these kinds of fallacies. So that's the basics of the psychological obstacles. And next week we'll be looking over the philosophical obstacles. If you need any help, just email me. Be sure to read the chapter. With this particular video, you need to make sure you summarize it in your own words with proper MLA 8 formatting, and check your assignments. Be sure to post on the discussion board and get involved with the thoughts that we're having here. We'll see you next time.